In this video, we will replace the gears on a Spyker broadcast spreader. Spyker's lifetime warranty applies to both the metal bevel gear and metal pinion gears on our Ergo Pro models and select Pro series, including the Mulch N More, the 175-pound toe spreader, and Legacy Pro Series spreaders. If Spyker's metal gears ever do happen to need replacing, just send us your model number and serial number by contacting customer service using the Contact Us form in the comments of this video or by calling 1-800-972-6130. Your Spyker product should also be registered at spyker.com. A direct link to our product registration page can also be found in the comments of this video. Tools required: needle nose pliers, a Phillips head screwdriver, a 1/8" pin punch, and a hammer or mallet. Safety glasses and gloves are also recommended. Step 1. Remove the agitator and felt washer from inside the hopper by pulling out the pin with the needle nose pliers and sliding off the felt washer. Step 2. Using extreme caution, slowly turn the spreader upside down to rest on its hopper, allowing the handle assembly to hang down over the edge of the table. Step 3A. Remove the fan driver wheel by sliding the metal keychain loop out of the pin and then sliding the driver pin out of the wheel and axle. Then slide the wheel off of the axle and remove the bearing from inside of the frame and slide the bearing off of the axle as well. Step 3B. Repeat this step on the other side, using needle nose pliers to remove the pin from the end of the axle. Then slide the wheel off of the axle, making sure to catch the washer and set it aside. Slide the next washer and the bearing off of the end of the axle. Step 4. Remove the enclosed gear casing, using a Phillips head screwdriver to remove all 8 screws from the case. You should be able to use your finger to hold the lock nuts in place when unscrewing the 8 Phillips head screws, making sure to keep them in a safe place. You will need these nuts and bolts in order to replace the gear casing. After all 8 screws and lock nuts are removed, very carefully remove the front of the gearbox with the Zerk fitting from the back and the gears. The gears may be a little stuck to the back of the gearbox, so you may need to pop them out before removing the back of the gearbox. Step 5. Pull the spinner shaft out from the hopper, but keep it in the working area. We will be replacing the gear at the top of this shaft. Step 6. Remove the wheel axle from the frame by sliding the axle to the right, then left. Take note of the large gear teeth orientation. Step 7A. Replacing the large gear. Remove the large gear by sliding the bushing off of the end of the axle, then sliding the sleeve off of the end of the axle, and removing the axle pin from the gear and the axle. Then slide the gear off of the axle and replace the old gear with the new gear, which can be found on the Spyker parts store, part number 1001516. Step 7B. Adding the new gear. When replacing the new gear, slide it onto the axle in the same orientation, making sure the teeth are facing inward as shown and the holes in the axle align with the holes in the gear. Step 7C. Reinstall the pin through the holes in the gear and the axle. Then, slide the sleeve back onto the axle, making sure it wraps over the pin on the gear. Finally, slide the bushing back onto the axle, keeping the gear in place. At this stage, you should apply grease to the gear, making sure to thoroughly cover all of the gear teeth, ensuring the best performance. Step 8. Pinion gear replacement. Remove the bushing from the end of the shaft and slide the other bushing away from the pinion gear. Support the shaft on both ends of the pinion gear by using the opening of a vise or blocks of wood. Then, using a hammer and an 1/8" pin punch, gently tap the roll pin back out through the shaft. When tapping the pin with a mallet, use caution not to bend the axle. You also may need to use needle nose pliers to fully remove the pin. Then replace the old pinion gear with the new pinion gear. The pinion gear can be found on the Spyker parts store, part number 1001518. Now replace the pinion gear, making sure to keep the orientation the same, with the cone pointed upwards and the holes in both the gear and the axle aligned so that you can re-add the pin. Supporting the axle on both sides of the pinion gear, hammer the roll pin through the new pinion gear and shaft until the roll pin has equal lengths on both sides. Step 9. With a multi-purpose grease, lubricate the pinion gear. And if you haven't already, also add grease to the large gear, making sure to thoroughly coat all of the gear teeth for the best performance. Step 10. Confirm the correct orientation of all of the components. Step 11. Insert the wheel axle with the large gear through the frame legs by sliding one end through one leg frame and then the other end through the other leg frame, orienting the gear in the center. Step 12. Re-adding the spinner axle. Make sure the bushing and the felt washer are pulled down towards the gear. You may need to use a tool if the felt washer gets caught up in the spinner. And then add the second plastic bushing to the end of the shaft. And insert the spinner shaft with the pinion gear through the hopper bottom, once again confirming the correct orientation. Step 13. Reinstall both sides of the gear cover back onto the gears. Note, the covers have grooves to capture the flanges on the bushings. The ridges on all of the bushings should all fit into the grooves on the back of the case. When adding the front of the case, note the orientation of the Zark fitting. If the two halves don't fit as shown, you may want to check the component orientations again. In order to fully protect the gears, make sure the two halves of the gearbox fully enclose the gears. When you're sure all of the holes in both halves line up, pass all 8 Phillips head screws through both of the halves. Using your fingers, add the lock nuts on the end to keep the two halves in place. Then, using a Phillips head screwdriver, make sure each of these screws are tight to ensure that no materials get into your gears. Step 15A. Add the idle wheel. Install the wheel axle bearings, the washers, add a wheel, and secure the idle wheel to the axle with the washer and the roux pin, making sure the axle is slid all the way through in order to install the roux pin through the axle holes and around the end of the axle. Step 15B. Now add the driver wheel, sliding an axle bearing down the axle and through the leg frame. Then adding 2 washers onto the end of the axle and adding the wheel. Since this wheel will drive the fan, you need to make sure that the holes in the axle line up with the holes in the wheel. Then pass the pin through both, connecting the wheel to the axle. And secure the pin in place by passing the metal keychain loop through the hole in the bottom of the pin. Step 16. Using extreme caution, slowly flip the spreader onto its side. Step 17. Re-adding the agitator. Reinstall the felt washer and reinsert the cotter pin through the base of the agitator, making sure the pin is fully pulled through so the curved part of the pin wraps around the axle, holding it in place. Then slowly flip your spreader back onto its wheels. Your Spyker gear replacement should now be complete. For questions about Spyker gear replacement, call Spyker customer service at 1-800-972-6130. Spyker, go with the pros.